Mr. Zamecki, you recently picketed outside the Lakewood Church here in Houston during afternoon rush hour with a sign that read, "Tax this church." Can you explain to us what was your motivation out there doing that?
Recently, Lakewood Church has been in the news because of a break-in into their building where a severely large amount of money was stolen out of one of their safes, and the investigation is still happening, I understand. But in the news and finding out about that, we all discovered a little bit of information about how much money they take in donations during their services. And they said a little over $600,000 in one weekend of donations just in what was given right then and there during their services. And a lot of people were kind of shocked by that and are not truly aware of just how big this church is. And a lot of people in our economy, especially here in Texas, are having difficulty with finances, and we all have to pay taxes and various different kinds of taxes, those of us who do have to pay taxes. And Lakewood Church is one of those churches, of course, that they don't have to pay taxes, and but it's still a megachurch that is making a great deal of profit, and that's quite obvious. And they've gone out of their way to show the world that they are very successful financially and are being very extravagant about that. And their building, of course, is a giant symbol of that as well. And I and a lot of other Americans feel that when tax exemption is given in a blanket fashion to religious groups, especially religious groups that are extremely profitable, that is not only a leg up and a special right, a special consideration and a special advantage given to those churches, but that it's also a problem for the community. Because, for example, the building they occupy used to be the Summit. And for many, many years, I and many other people in Houston used to go to the Summit to see shows, music, and sports, things like that, and it paid property taxes and sales tax and functioned as a for-profit business that helped the community. And that all changed when the Osteens and their church bought that building, and now it's a church. Of course, it is a completely different kind of organization running it. And it's essentially the same thing, though. A big stage with tens of thousands of seats for the audience where a show takes place. Except that now, two things are much different. It doesn't put a lot of money into the tax coffers anymore, helping the community. And also, even though a lot of people say, come on down to our church, our Christian church welcomes you, even if you're not Christian, come on down and we'll make you feel at home at least for an hour on services and during services on Sundays. And you can probably do that at Lakewood Church, though I haven't tried. It's obvious that there is a social barrier that exists around the average church of any clear denomination, especially this one, and that barrier is very simple. Most religious people will go to the church that they feel comfortable at, and there are so many different denominations, and some of them are very clear about wanting, particular belief sets of beliefs and systems as a part of their denomination, which is unique to their denomination, and want to keep it pure, so to speak. And so a lot of people feel comfortable only going to churches that agree with them, and there's certainly plenty to choose from. But obviously a church like this with the prosperity gospel and prosperity evangelism is going to turn off a lot of Christians who, first of all, feel that Jesus did not like wealth. It did not want people to become wealthy, and that this church symbolizes the opposite attitude. But also denominational differences besides that. A lot of people will make sure to avoid the wrong church at the wrong denomination and not even give it a chance. So all in all, we're talking about a building that has been changed from being a public place to go and enjoy and do something that helps you and them and the community to being a very narrow kind of organization owning a building that is for a particular group of people only. And then again, they're not going to say, don't come in, I'm sure. But it's a church. And many people have stated, and I think this is realistic, Sunday mornings are the most segregated time in the United States per week because of churches. And again, it's not a system where they keep people out. It's a system where they have fine-tuned and absolutely created a denominational place for people to go and get a specific brand of a particular religion. and not another brand of the same religion. So we're talking about a church that is for some people and not for everyone. It's not a public place. Anyway, my solution was simply, if there are going to be big financial problems where, for example, the public education in Texas needs more funding, that we could increase that funding and funding for other things we need more of if we simply open up our minds a little to the idea of taxing businesses that pretend to be poor or needing a special financial leg up the way a tax exemption gives it to them. And the Lakewood Church is an example of megachurches taking the concept of profit-taking too far and being a nonprofit religious organization that's tax-exempt and acting in a financial manner as if they are a business that doesn't have to pay taxes. And I and other Americans feel that's wrong, and that the Osteens have gone on television many times to preach their ways of thinking and their morals and never mention that Jesus condemned individual and independent wealth and said more than 3 times in the New Testament very clearly that rich people are not going to heaven, and it's not something that's unclear or a parable. This all just adds up to the fact that in the United States we have evolved into a country that has a great many very for-profit businesses like that one that are being treated like they need a tax exemption, and it hurts the community to take that tax money out and away from the use of the community. A lot of churches do this in small neighborhoods. They'll set up a church where there's a lot of poverty and some street crime, and people are desperate for jobs, and they'll set up a church that doesn't pay property taxes. That is almost sometimes a square block out of a city that's not putting anything in the property tax. Now, you don't have to be a financial expert to understand that we all pay higher taxes and more different kinds of taxes so that churches don't have to pay any, when we now know that religion in the United States, in the industry of churches, is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. It's not simply a place to go on Sundays to show devotion. It's a business, and it's a very large business. And some denominations own huge amounts of real estate and stock and for-profit companies, and that just doesn't count their numerous buildings and their holdings, and some of them get housing allowance for the clergy. The list goes on, and the United States has so many of these megachurches and televangelists that are profit-taking. I and others feel that it is important to consider taxing them. Now, not all churches, I would say this is a tall order to ask society to embrace, of course. It's a big idea that a lot of people are going to oppose, and I know that. Okay. That's why it should be done in a phased-in way with baby steps. That's my opinion. I'm no financial expert. I'm no tax expert, but I will say that if we just go to the most profitable churches like Lakewood, Trinity Broadcasting Network, other very large churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, all these very, very large churches with billions of dollars in banks across the United States can afford to pay, how about 1% of the property tax they would normally be asked to pay if they were not tax exempt. And the Summit, now Lakewood Church, a very large building in a very expensive part of town where property taxes are very high, and it's also a part of town where there is some poverty and some homelessness and needs. Now here's another issue a lot of people have asked about. What if these churches are doing good for the community by doing charity work, helping the homeless, things like that? And I applaud them for doing that, of course. All secular humanitarian work is humanism, and when churches do this, they're proving they don't need a religion in order to help people in need, but they're also proving that churches do help people fine. I agree, and I like that, and I want that to continue. Now, I wouldn't want taxation to hinder that. That's why, once again, I would go, first off, to the very most profitable churches. Now, Lakewood Church, being one of the most profitable churches in the world, actually does some charity work. I did some research, and they do help people in need. They do a giveaway once in a while to the homeless in Houston. That's nice. I also take part in a group that does that, so I respect that a great deal. And they also announced on their website recently that they sent some backpacks to a school in El Salvador and donated them, free to little children, students in the school, and that helped, and that's very nice. And I would never want that to stop. You see, when they do something good, atheists like me, state church separationists like me, ex-Christians like me, we applaud. We applaud this if you're doing some good in an honest and effective way. That's a good thing. And I don't want anybody to stop doing that. I don't want to hinder it, and I don't want to subtract from the financial needs those actions incur. I want those to continue. So again, the megachurches that are making plenty of money, they could pay a lot more in taxes than 1%. How about baby steps? We start small, just within 1% of their property tax they would normally have to pay. And again, I applaud their charity work, but I don't think at Lakewood Church they'll ever have to scale back on any charity work they do, ever. In fact, I believe they could do a lot more because they make that much money. Now, I know some Christians who agree with me on this issue, and two of them were out there with me on Monday picketing Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church on the sidewalk in a peaceful, friendly way. And I found a lot of positive reactions and support from people driving their cars. Very busy place on Highway 59 at rush hour. I couldn't count the number of thumbs ups and honks and waves and smiles. Some people rolled their window down and said, I totally agree. You see, so this is an idea, I believe, that not only is, it's got a quiet underswell of support from a lot of people who don't necessarily get on TV to talk about it, but also I believe, financially speaking, it's an idea that its time has come. And every time the legislature in Texas goes up there into that Capitol building and slashes our state budget for things we need, and then tries to focus all attention on slashing abortion rights. You see, we've got to reprioritize, and with all the homelessness that's still a problem in our society, even with all the nonprofits, charities, and religious groups that are functioning and have been for many, many years, we still have homelessness as a problem. I really think this idea, it's something that we should try, at least try. You know, we've tried a lot of things and then said, no, it's a bad idea, turn around and go back the way we were and go back to the way we did things. Like with prohibition of alcohol, made a mistake, turned back around, we survived as a nation. And so if we try something bold like this, we might end up with billions of dollars of tax money that won't hurt the churches that pay it, and we can channel that into fixing some schools or buying some new ambulances or fixing whatever is wrong that taxes pay for. And I believe as a taxpayer, I strongly support a rational use of tax money like that. And isn't it great to be an American?
Well, Mr. Zamecki, was this picket of Lakewood Church, was this an individual act on your part, or did you do this representing some organization? Or
I was doing this purely as an individual, as I am an independent state church separation activist, and I have been involved with other organizations that do this sort of thing. But as I said, this particular picket and my project in talking about it is my own.
Are you planning on picketing Lakewood Church again in the future?
Absolutely. I'm going to picket that church again. It was so fun. It was safe. It was enjoyable. I smiled the whole time. I got a lot of positive reactions, and even Christians stopped who agreed with me to help me picket. Yes, I'm doing this again, probably a weekday when there's a whole lot of traffic on 59. And I want to get as many people as possible reading this sign, because it's very rare to see this idea put out there in public, isn't it? And it made a lot of people immediately smile. I think that it's an idea that should be considered, and I want to bring this to the public again and again and again, yes. And isn't it great? Once again, we have a country where we can do this legally, safely, freely, and there's even a nice new sidewalk right there next to their lawn, and I'll be on public property, yes. And I want them to see me. I want them to hear this interview. I want them to find out that there are people seriously saying they can afford it. If they can afford a jet, they can afford some tax. 1%. Anyway.
Some critics argue that tax exemptions for churches violate the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Do you agree with that?
Yes, you know, the argument has been given to us in the opposite direction, that if churches had to pay taxes, that would create a state-church mingling and melding. Instead, they want the tax exemption to take place so that churches are left alone by government. Now, it sounds very clever, and it sounds noble, But the bottom line is, we know a tax-exempt status on any business that makes hundreds of millions of dollars per year would be unfair to competing businesses, and it would be unjust because they make that much money and that they are a for-profit situation in the first place. And then we find churches like this one and others which are so successful financially and so big that they begin to look like a business. And the only difference, suddenly the only difference that's really important financially is that tax exemption. And so it is absolutely, it's something that common sense just dictates that if they're going to play the role of being independent from society in that degree, that they shouldn't also try to mirror so much of society by competing in a capitalistic way so that they can accomplish the goal of becoming wealthy. You see, and a lot of, again, Jesus said he did not like wealth at all. And it is a round of laughter every time I see a Mercedes or a very, very expensive-looking car going into or coming out of a church parking lot, and it's a Christian church, and these are people who worship a pauper. Well, he also said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And a lot of people felt that meant not just the coin he was talking about, but the money. And the money could help. The money could help in a better way with the government spending it in a secular way. You see, a lot of religions also take some of the money that's donated to them and spend it helping people, but they also lace that help with some religious proselytizing. And will even throw a Bible in with a meal. Or sometimes they'll take a Bible instead of a meal and give those out. It's not a joke. It's something that's happened before with actual donations. And I feel that if they were to pay that money, or just that 1% in property tax that they can easily afford, over to the government could do a better job of disseminating that money to the people who could use it the most and not preach, you see, and that save that money on those Bibles. There's plenty of Bibles. There is no need to throw Bibles at people who are hungry and call that charity. So I applaud the legitimate charity work they've done, but I must say it does not mean they need a blanket tax exemption. They can do well to pay a little bit, like we all have to.
What are your thoughts on the way that nonprofit organizations, nonprofit charities are taxed versus the way churches are taxed?
Yes, and this was one of the first things I researched when I got into nonprofit activism. The differences between IRS tax exemption that is for groups that are registered as educational organizations is much different from the requirements and the paperwork and everything and the oversight that religious organizations get. It's a completely different approach. And yes, there's a great deal of financial information that a nonprofit educational organization has to produce on a regular basis for the IRS that churches don't. And I've seen some of these filings, financial reports on IRS forms that churches have filled out and compared them to educational organizations' forms. And it's mind-numbing. You'd say, this is irresponsible. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars over many, many years. And a church that is so big, it may be around for another 100 years. And they're taking in so much money that at least there should be some government oversight. Because, as we know from Benny Hinn, sometimes these televangelists especially will misappropriate their money and get in trouble. Benny Hinn got in big trouble in Texas many years ago, and he was convicted. And he had to move his business out of Texas into Florida and do business in other places out of Texas because he got caught. And he was basically using his donations wrong and deceiving his congregation all over the television. Now, Lakewood Church goes farther, I believe. It's like televangelism, plus they have this big building, and it's such an enviable building. But this is also a building that would have generated a lot of taxes. And, you know, I think, once again, we could avoid taxing any of the small or medium-sized churches and just start with the ones that are obscenely wealthy. And again, I do want to state, though, that this is not out of anger. This is logic. This is just common sense and reasoning and financial understanding of the imbalances and inequalities that happen in our society financially. You know, we don't have an organized, set-up caste system the way India did for many, many years. But we have an economic caste system that is almost unspoken. And it is a reality for the working poor to pay lots of money in taxes and not bring home much more paycheck. Because of that, I just think that 1% of property tax on a megachurch is not too much to ask.
I was doing some research on this topic, and I discovered that there are some churches that actually do pay taxes. Were you aware of that fact, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I did, and I've discovered some which pay taxes. They're not really big churches, most of them, the ones I've discovered anyway. And it's noble, it's honorable. In fact, there was one that made the news that started out wanting to pay taxes. And we just made the blanket announcement to everybody in the media, we can do this. And I was absolutely stunned, and I'm elated. I said, here's a church where they're brave enough to put this idea out, first of all, because it's not a traditional idea. And a lot of Christians are conservative. When they hear an untraditional idea about how the church is going to be run, a lot of them really don't like that. So this church was bold and said, we can pay it. We can, and we want to. I think a lot of nonprofit organizations that are secular can do the same thing. It can really help our society to have that amount more. And again, if we just took 1% of the property taxes on the mega churches that have a really big building and a lot of property, it could end up being a lot of money. It could help. But some churches pay taxes. That's true. I appreciate that. I applaud it. I'd like to see more of that. I think it's very, very rare. But I do know, however, that it is not easy to get a tax-exempt status from the IRS. And so that may be also one reason why brand new churches would have to wait on that.
Some feminists argue that women pay taxes to subsidize clergy and other employees' paychecks when such positions are overwhelmingly and legally restricted to men, and that's fundamentally unfair and unjust. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. The Roman Catholic Church, as well as the Mormon Church and several other major denomination churches that are very old, very successful, some of them are still held back a bit socially and culturally by old world patriarchal traditional ideas and ideals and rules for the way their churches are set up and organized. And some of them are very archaic. Of course, nuns and priests still supposed to be celibate, and we now know that trying to get people to live a celibate life can be like squeezing a tennis ball. You can squeeze it, but you can't pop it. I don't know. It's one of those things where there are so many old churches that are still very dominant and very influential in our society, which bring with them traditional old world ideas, which are very slow to change. Churches, and even the Catholic Church, does evolve and change. You know, they changed their mind on evolution. They now basically say it's essentially a truth, a fact, okay? And then recently on limbo, they said limbo was an old idea that's not really biblical, and we're changing our mind on it. There's no limbo. I applauded. I said, we're slowly encroaching. Reason and logic are encroaching on these old world businesses that get this tax-exempt status, and eventually the people running them are finding out, figuring things out. Like with this new pope, I think they figured out there needs to be a better attention and focus paid to PR, public representation, because the previous pope looked like the emperor from Star Wars and acted like it too. So a lot of churches are figuring these things out. But still, yes, if women want to have an equal role in a major denomination of Christianity, even today in the United States, they need to shop around. It's sad. Same thing with gays and acceptance. There's a little church down the road from me that's not Catholic, but it's a little church. I don't even know what the denomination is. They've got a marquee that says, when man's laws change, it doesn't change God's laws. And I think what they're subtly referring to is the new wave of states allowing legally same-sex marriage. And they're opposed to that, obviously, and so is God, the God of the Bible. And so they're held back a little bit socially. And it may be their heartfelt opinion. it may be for some of them just what the congregation is supposed to believe, you see. So I'm one of these people who feels humanity is evolving like this, and people are figuring out the mistakes of the past and trying not to repeat them. And in fact, one really good example is Harold Camping, who predicted the apocalypse incorrectly and is no longer with us. But people learn from that. And even Christians, the most devout religious people, learn from that. And they learn the obvious, which is if you can't back up what you're saying, you might as well just say something that doesn't matter. Because when it matters, and you set a date, and it's a tangible event that people can really tell whether it happened or not, then it becomes a problem for religion, and they really need to scale back. See, when science says we've discovered actual, tangible evidence all around us that suggests that life changes over time, it's hard to refute that when they can bring in a truckload of fossils, literally warehouses full of fossils of all different kinds of animals, and that's tangible evidence. Whereas the church would say, well, we have some wood that we found on top of a mountain, therefore that's evidence of Noah's Ark. We found Noah's Ark. No. So even the most arcane leaders of these churches that are really old and tradition-based can see the light, so to speak, and figure out which way the wind is blowing and pick the progressive, reasonable ideas that come through society to religion, slowly but surely changing and improving their attitude and actions towards humans in a humane way. I applaud that. And I think one thing that would help them also is if they took more personal responsibility and paid some tax on the wealth that comes into certain megachurches and televangelists. I do really appreciate this opportunity, and I think that ideas like this really need more exposure, so this is helpful. I thank you.
Again, we've been talking with local activist Joe Zamecki, who picketed outside the Lakewood Church during afternoon rush hour this past Tuesday. He held up a homemade sign that read, "Tax this church." Zamecki says he will be out at the Lakewood Church picketing again next Wednesday, which will be April the 2nd, during rush hour. He hasn't decided whether morning or afternoon rush hour at this point, so if you travel that way during those times, you may look for him. Signing off, this is KPFT local news reporter David Rozycki.